Everyone, I'm Kyle Gerrild, and I have the privilege of being the pastor of Countryside Free Methodist Church in Sandusky, Michigan. The message you are about to hear was previously recorded. If you'd like to catch one of our services in action, we'd love to have you stop by for our 10 a.m. service, or check it out on our Facebook page at Countryside Free Methodist Church. God bless, and thank you for listening.
If you would please turn with me in your Bibles this morning to Daniel chapter 1. Last week, we began digging into the Old Testament book of Daniel and our new Standing Tall series. And we actually started last week with chapter 2 of Daniel, not because it's necessarily a better place to start, because, hey, let's face it, the beginning is generally always the best place to start with something, right? But rather because, honestly, I really wanted to save the story and the message of chapter 1 for today. And I think you're going to find it fitting on multiple levels. Now, to all the moms in the room and all those listening today, let me just say, this is not going to be a traditional Mother's Day message, all right? You're not going to hear the word mom or mother in our scripture today. You're not even going to hear a mother's name. But I think that you will agree by the time we get to the end of the passage here this morning that moms had and still have a huge part to play, not only in this story, but in our faith stories as well. So let's dig in. Daniel chapter 1, beginning at verse 1, God's word says that in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God. So this siege by Nebuchadnezzar and his victory over Jehoiakim and the people of Jerusalem and Judah was the direct result of their disobedience, the disobedience of God's people. You know, Bible history tells us that the nation of Israel had existed in the promised land for about 450 years before they had their first king. And during that time, God led the people through a number of judges he raised up, beginning with a guy named Joshua. But you know, the people decided that they wanted to be more like the nations around them by having a human king to lead them instead of God leading them. God had given them a theocracy, right? Government by God. But they wanted a monarchy, a government by a single person. And in fact, it was that same basic thought that got the people of Israel into trouble over and over again, wanting to be like the people around them, worshiping their gods and following their customs rather than worshiping God Almighty and following Him. And let's face it, folks, it's the same basic thought that gets most of us into trouble still to this day, wanting to be more like the world, following after the things the world thinks are important and lifting those things up rather than lifting up God and following Him wholeheartedly. So Israel existed in the promised land for 450 years, led by God through His judges. And then the people cried out for a king so, again, they could be like the other nations around them. And God gave them their first king, King Saul, who barely made it out of the gate before he started messing things up, let's face it. So God handed the kingship off to David and his family. And they were able to follow God and maintain relative order for all of, about 2 generations. David and Solomon, both of whom had their own problems and weaknesses. In fact, pretty much every king of Israel made one or more bad choices at some point. And many of those decisions affected the rest of the people in the kingdom. Now check out what Moses told the people of Israel way back about 850 years before Nebuchadnezzar, so way before any of Israel's first kings. Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 28, "If you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all His commands and decrees I am giving you today," a lot of things are going to happen. Scroll down to verse 49. He says, "Also the Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the ends of the earth, like an eagle swooping down. a nation whose language you will not understand, a fierce-looking nation without respect for the old or pity for the young. They will devour the young of your livestock and the crops of your land until you are destroyed. They will leave you no grain, new wine or olive oil, nor any calves of your herds or lambs of your flocks until you are ruined. They will lay siege to all the cities throughout your land until the high fortified walls in which you trust fall down. They will besiege all the cities throughout the land the Lord your God is giving you. So this siege by Nebuchadnezzar and his victory over Jehoiakim and those of Jerusalem and Judah, it was the result of the disobedience of God's people. And many people these days are saying things like they can't or they won't believe in a God who would be so cruel as the God we read about in the Old Testament. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I've heard it a number of times. A God who would bring such harsh disciplines upon his very own people. Well, first of all, let me just point out that a person refusing to believe in something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, that it ceases to exist, right? For example, a person may refuse to believe in gravity with all their might, right? But if they step off of a building, guess what? Their refusal to believe is quickly going to meet the reality of the pavement below. And the more I read the Bible, the more I learn and come to understand God, the more I see that even here in the Old Testament, even in the midst of these disciplines, ours is a great and loving God. It kind of reminds me of the Would You Rather icebreaker I used to do with the teens way back in the day. In this activity, you'd ask a room full of teens to choose between two distinct differences or preferences and have the youth move to one side of the room to tell you what their decision was. For example, would you rather give a 20-minute speech to a room full of people, or would you rather rake someone else's yard for an hour? Okay? Now, for most people, that's a fairly easy question to answer, right? Fairly easy choice. There's probably going to be a couple over here that everybody else is just kind of scratching their head. What is wrong with those people? Most people would be raking leaves, right? But as far as following after God, the question is more like this. Would you rather see a 2-year-old child heading unattended toward a busy highway? Or would you rather see them pulled back by a firm but loving parent? The fact that God says, no, that's not what's best for you to some things does not make him a hateful being. Just like being a parent saying no to their child who wants to play in the street, it's not hateful. It's not being hateful if they are more concerned about the person's greater good than about what that person's whims or uninformed desires are. You see, that's why God disciplined his people back in the Old Testament, why he allowed them to be carried off into captivity in places like Babylon, and why he sometimes says no to our heart's desires now. It's not because he doesn't love us, but because he does love us, and he has the bigger view of the picture of our lives. All right, back to Daniel, verse 3. It says that then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. And the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. And they were to be trained for 3 years. And after that, they were to enter the king's service. All right, we touched on this last week. Now, to me, this sounds almost counterintuitive, at least in our day and age. You don't really hear of countries in our day who, after going to battle with another country, then take some of the best young people, and then from that country they've conquered, and then they raise them up to basically lead the conquering country. We don't hear that these days. But Nebuchadnezzar was looking to improve his kingdom, and he understood that you don't make the world better by squashing, snuffing out, or stifling the thinkers and the visionaries, but rather by encouraging them and exchanging ideas with them. And so that's what he was seeking to do with those countries that he was capturing, including Judah and Jerusalem. So he developed this sort of advisors in training program for a number of the young men who had been carried off, and among those were those captured from Judah. Verse 6 says that among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief official gave them new names. These were Babylonian names, okay? To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, many of you who've grown up in and around the church will recognize these last three names, often heard together: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they have a stand tall type of faith story of their own, which, Lord willing, we're going to get to next week, all right? So come back, check it out. But verse 8, we're going to continue. It says that Daniel, though, resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. So Daniel and his three amigos, they were Jews, okay, now living in Babylon. And as Jews, God had given them some very specific instructions on the things that they could and could not eat. Now, probably most of us would know about pork, all right? They weren't supposed to eat pork, nor could they eat actually the meat of any animal that didn't have both a split hoof and chew the cud. As a matter of fact, here are some of the other foods that they could and couldn't eat. I'll just let you take a look. Left column is the yes, right column is the no, okay? So the main meats: cattle, sheep, goats, deer, things that they could eat. They couldn't eat the pigs, the rabbits, or the camels. Ooh, not that you'd want to, all right? But let me just say this, okay, along those lines. I'm not sure which of those critters in the no column were present and were presented to Daniel and his friends, but I'll tell you this: there are a couple there in the yes column that I wouldn't want to touch. Even those, to sample. But whatever it was, Daniel knew that some of the items from the king's table were on the no list. And it would have been wrong for Daniel and his friends to eat those things. It would have been a violation of the guidelines set forth by God for his chosen people. Guidelines that Daniel and his friends would have been learning from the time they first started to learn what it meant to follow God. So these young men, they'd been handed a faith heritage from their parents and grandparents and those who went before them. It had been passed along and was now in their laps. But now they were living in a foreign land. Different people, different language, different customs, different beliefs. And they had a choice to make. Do we hold on to our heritage of faith, or do we chuck it and go our own way? And I submit to you this morning that every generation has to make a similar choice, the consequences of which will be felt and experienced for generations to come. And folks, we are now seeing the results in our country when the majority of people are saying we are chucking our heritage of faith and we are going our own way, the way of the world. And there's going to come a day, if it hasn't come already, when you are going to be faced with the choice: hold on to your faith or go the way the world is going. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself. Daniel took a stand. Daniel said, no, I'm not going that way. I'm not participating in those activities. Even though they were out of the house, away from their parents, he resolved not to defile himself. Verse 9 continues. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. So the official was concerned. Daniel, I've been instructed to give you the best food available, the best the country has to offer, and you're rejecting it. If I give you what you want and the king sees you looking worse than the other guys, he is literally going to have my head. Basically, he was saying, dude, our king beat your king. Our country beat your country. Our food beats your food. Eat our food, right? That's what he's saying. Please, Verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, I said, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And right here, just a few lines into Daniel's story, we begin to see some of the wisdom with which God had blessed this young man. He didn't try to force his way on the official, but rather he said, hey, we don't want to get you in trouble. So let's try a little experiment, okay? Just put us to the test. Put us on this diet for 10 days, and then compare us with the rest of the guys that are eating from the king's table, and make your judgment call after that. So here we see what, in all likelihood, at least from what I can tell, is the first recorded 10-day fitness challenge ever. Okay, put us to the test for 10 days. Put us on veggies and water diet only for 10 days, and then see for yourself how we appear. So here's one of the lessons that we can glean from Daniel's story. Our faith and our food choices affect our lives. Have you ever done something like Daniel was suggesting here? Gone on a whole or a partial fast, either of food or something else? My guess is if you've ever had blood drawn, you've had to experience that at some degree, okay? But for Daniel and his friends, it was critical for staying true to their faith. And for us as well, fasting, either partial or whole fasting, it's an important spiritual discipline to exercise periodically so that we can focus our attention better on God. So how does fasting do that? It changes your perspective. It forces you to make more conscious decisions about your diet and or your routines. And if you do it right, a whole or partial fast of food or something else will give you many opportunities to focus on God and the spiritual food that he gives us. So guess what I'm going to challenge you to do here coming up in the not too distant future? I'm going to challenge you to take Daniel's 10-day challenge. Okay? Now hear me out before you put your earplugs in. Okay? I want to challenge everyone here. 10 days of doing things differently. 10 days of changing at least one of your routines. 10 days of living your life in a different way so that you can position yourself to focus on what God has for you in your next steps of growth. Now, as I already mentioned, in our faith community, this kind of challenge is often referred to as a fast or fasting. And there are different types of fasting. As I already mentioned, there's whole and there's partial fasting. There's fasting where you're giving up food, and there's fasting where you're giving up certain beverages. There's fasting where you're giving up other things. Okay, so but we're not talking about a whole fast here. No, we're talking about baby steps, all right? Now, I'm challenging you to join me for either a partial fast of food, like Daniel's veggies and water only fast, or a complete fast of something else, like maybe social media, or your daily favorite beverage. If you choose Daniel's diet, I'm going to strongly recommend that you talk to your doctor first, okay? That's just a smart move. And we will we'll provide you with a meal plan, a 10-day meal plan. I've been looking this up, doing a little homework on it. There are some great meal plans out there. And what that means is that we will give you a shopping list and the recipes to go along with this 10-day plan. And then you'll have to go to the grocery store and pick them out yourself, okay? I mean, sorry, I'd love to give you the prepared meals, but it would be great, wouldn't it? But I just can't do that. So, but how do you know what to choose? How would you know what to choose for the best thing to take a break from, the best thing for this challenge for you? Well, you're going to have to work that out with God, but I'm going to put a few things up here on the screen for you, and I can tell you it will probably be the one thing either on this list or that God just zings right at your heart that you would have the hardest time giving up for 10 days. The thing that you would resist the most. Oh, I'm not going to do that. I couldn't do that. Think about it. One of the purposes of a faith fast is to draw you closer to God by leaning on him in those times when you are missing something that you regularly go to. Right? If you give up something that you don't regularly do, what's the point? You're not going to be thinking about it anyway. But if you set aside something that is your go-to comfort, then you quickly start having opportunities to connect with God and lean on him in a whole new way. So like I said, we're going to have materials ready for you by next Sunday to pick up and start checking those things out and give you time again to connect with the doctor about what a Daniel type fast might be, veggies only. So like I said, we're going to give you time before we start on it. We'll probably be starting the actual 10-day challenge on June 1st, just so it's easy to remember where I'm at in the process, right? You're going to have time to think about it. But Daniel's 10-day challenge, I want you to think of this. It's not just giving something up, but replacing it with something better. Replacing it with time with God. All right, so let's go back to Daniel's personal challenge. So Daniel asked the chief official to give him and his 3 friends only veggies and water for 10 days. All right, here we go. Pick it up in verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, guess what? They looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Better than the guys who were eating whatever meat and other delicacies were offered at the king's table. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. He continued the diet for them down the road. They proved their point that honoring our faith heritage by following God's instructions is a good thing. Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds, which we saw a little bit last week. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. That was God's hand of blessing on these 4 young men. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So I want to go back to that last point for just a moment. Honoring our faith heritage by following God's instructions is a good thing. And this is where I mentioned, you wouldn't hear moms or mothers mentioned in here, but our faith heritage, very much so. And guess what? Honoring our faith heritage pleases God. It also honors our parents and our faith parents. And it's a testimony to others. We all have the same Heavenly Father. And we all have or have had an earthly mother and father. And for some of us, those earthly parents were the ones who introduced us to Jesus. But I recognize the fact that for some of us, it was somebody else other than our parents who introduced us first to Jesus. And in a way, essentially kind of became our faith parents here on earth. A lot like Paul was saying when he called Timothy his true son in the faith. Paul was his faith parent. So whether it was your earthly parents or someone else who introduced you to Jesus, when you honor your faith heritage by following God's instructions, you honor God and also you're honoring your faith parents. And when we do that, just like Daniel and his friends, those actions become a testimony to those around us, to the rest of our world. They become a light. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful week.